I'm just getting used to having to say that twice, aren't I? You all try it first this time. Oh, wow. So there's the trick. Okay, I've got it. Good evening. Hope you had a good day. I was sitting there before we began worship, and quite honestly, during part of it, thinking probably about what I should not have been thinking about. But the connections that I have of those who are here tonight and others just keep going on and on. For example, I was thinking Tina and I have lived in the same house as two of you all. So we rented the Bedwell estate at 209, as your mom called it, as I well remember, when we were trying to figure out what we wanted to be when we grew up. And it was also about that time that we sold our house to Byron and Rachel in that period of time. And I think I mentioned this the first night. I think 3 or 4 who were on the board who brought me to Columbia are here at Southgate that I feel very close to. And until 15, 16 years ago, Columbia, Tennessee was only a place that we drove through and a place where I put on applications and other things as the place of my birth, because I was born in what at the time was Murray County Hospital. Did you remember that? Because at the time my dad was preaching at Sandy Hook. And so even roots in Murray County that go way back, and so we are proud to be Murray Countyans, and in fact I could keep going with so many Freed-Hardeman connections. In fact, Sean and I worked together at Freed-Hardeman, and Clint's mom and I worked a lot of years together on different projects and things at Freed-Hardeman, and it just goes on and on and on. So when I say it feels good to be here, I truly mean it feels good to be here. You all have a special place here, and don't take it for granted. So tonight is the last lesson as we talk about parenting, and I will give my disclaimer again. Parenting is a difficult thing to talk about, and I don't want to claim to be the expert. And so hopefully what we talk about tonight and things that are shared will be helpful. And I'll have a few more comments in a minute, because I was thinking just a few minutes ago about some things that are really important. But look at what we have looked at each week, and I continue to use these because I think the reminder that children are a blessing and an heritage from the Lord, indeed, I don't think we can say that too much. And teaching our children to grow in wisdom and stature and favor with God and man, that fourfold growth is the goal as we continue to put what God expects from them in front of them in all aspects of life, not just on Sundays and Wednesdays. And the reminder to those of us who are the heads of our households that we have the ultimate responsibility in getting our children to heaven. We live in a day, and this day goes way back, where I think typically, culturally, that responsibility tends to fall more to the mothers than the fathers. And as we think about our growing up years, some of us, and as we think even oftentimes about those who are way more faithful to the Lord's church in all ways, it seems like so many times mothers take on this role. And so I just want to say that not to be negative or critical, but to remind us of the importance that we have, as fathers have in leading our family in such a way so that our children get to heaven. Last week we began looking at 6 different challenges which I have identified in this century that I call parenting challenges. The first one is that we be careful not to overprotect our children. Overprotected children who in the day we would say were spoiled generally don't turn out very well. But those who successfully go through hearing no, dealing with difficulties, and learning how, generally turn out better. And we talked about the importance of teaching them what do we do when we mess up. and how important it is for us as parents to be examples. And then number 3, last week we talked about the importance of the Lord's church in raising children to love the Lord, and how in our day so many people devaluing the Lord's church, and in our day in which so many people use the Lord's church as a take it or leave it type situation, we teach our children when we do that, that we can take it or leave it, or they can take it and leave it, and how important it is for us not to do that and be completely committed to the Lord's church. And this slide is out of place, and that one is where we're going, so I should have looked at them, Sean. Sean said, "Do you want to look at them?" And I said, "No, they're good." And so I may play with this a little bit as we go. But before I do that, I want to kind of ease into where we're going tonight, and that is to talk to you about how important it is to do what we're going to talk about tonight in the early years. In fact, John mentioned what he had told me a few days ago, that I believe, if I remember the numbers right, you'll have 23 2 years and older. We had in our young marrieds class at West 7th a couple of years, or maybe 3 years ago, we had 11 expecting at the same time. And I thought, wow, but 23 2 and under. So I want to illustrate some things, or call our attention to some things. Think about the research that most of us have heard through time when we have heard statistics like 95% of the child's personality is developed or established by the time they're age 5. Well, I don't know exactly where to put that number, but the concept, I am very convinced, is true. And in fact, as we think of our own children, when they became 2 and 3 years old, we could tell a lot about what they were going to be like. We could tell which ones were going to be introverted, which ones were going to be extroverted. We could tell which ones were going to be mischievous. We could tell which ones were going to be rule abiders. You know, I'm getting too close to home in a lot of ways, right? But don't miss my point. It's true. So many of those characteristics that we have carried all through life are somehow put in place very, very early on, right? Yeah, sure. We see it with ourselves. We've seen it with our children. Some of us have seen it with our grandchildren. And that's just a very true description, that those early years matter so very much. But I want to talk about a second concept, and that is this nature-nurture concept. You know, the concept of nature-nurture, the debate over why are we who we are, is it based more on environment, or is it based more on our genetic makeup, our DNA, our family tree? And I love that all through the years, the research continues to show it's about 50-50. It's about 50-50. Now, John, you may remember my first year at Columbia Academy, we would have Wednesday night area-wide youth get-together sometimes at Columbia Academy. And the first one we had, there was a guy that came up that I knew very well. He had been SGA president at Freed-Hardeman probably a year or two before you were there, or about those years. And I was the SGA sponsor, and so I worked very closely with Reed Swindle. But when I showed up in the auditorium at CA that night, I saw a Reed Swindle I had never seen before, because he had on one of these shirts with the tight bands on it, and his arms were humongous. And his chest was, you know, what happened? What happened was the nurture overcame the nature. Because Reed in college was a little guy. He was small, but he decided that he wanted to go against his biological genetic tendencies. and change those attributes about himself. That's why I like the nature-nurture research that indicates even though we have tendencies that are biological, and even though we have tendencies that are very deeply within our DNA, the right kind of nurture can mold those and fashion those. Now, we're going to talk here in number whatever about developing children's self-esteem. And even before I get into slides, just keep running with me. You're listening well. Keep thinking about where we're going to go here. What kids wind up causing the most heartaches? And without trying to become psychological or psychoanalytical, let's just do it in the country boy way of saying, it's those kids who have low self-esteem. At least that's part of it. Those kids who don't think much of themselves. Those kids who are always trying to prove something. Those kids where peer pressure makes such a big difference. Yeah, that's true, isn't it? And so the problem with talking about this as I am tonight is, I think generally we don't realize that until it's too late. We don't realize that until the kids are old enough that how they feel about themselves is largely already established. And so for those many of you tonight who have little ones, I want you to think about how important it is and how tricky it is and how difficult it is to find that sweet spot right there in the middle where you help them to feel good about themselves, but you don't raise cocky kids. Ooh, boy, that sweet spot is small, isn't it? But that sweet spot is so very important. Well, let's keep going with what I hope is here. Children's self-esteem plays a significant role in how they turn out, the point I just made. And so many things contribute to what their self-esteem is. We realize personality is a big part of it. We can have children and they have the same DNA, they're raised in the same environment, and one of them will need attention and one of them will run from attention. Why? Well, because children are different and personality covers so many pieces of the puzzle. What about birth order? Does birth order have anything to do with it? Do any middle children here? Do you believe birth order matters? Yes, of course you do. We could have fun talking about that story. But does it matter? Sure. I'm 3 years younger than an older sister who never made a B in her life. Do you think that had anything to do with how I turned out? How much time do you have? Yes, it did. It does. That's not me admitting anything I'm really embarrassed about. It's just truth. All of these things matter. Relationships with parents. Relationships with parents. And this is all over the board in terms of the dynamics because we have so many different dynamics. It's interesting how sometimes in some families, sons will attach more closely to fathers, and sometimes it's reversed. Sometimes the sons are more attached to moms and the girls to dads. Well, while I can't say more of the time it's this and more of the time it's this, what I will say is those relationships and the types of relationships they are has so much to do with the child's self-esteem. Now, what about this one? This one is a sticky one. Talents and abilities, and the early years are so important. Now, there's a dynamic that I saw through the years many, many times at Freed-Hardeman, and that is things very much change going from high school to college. And in the Deep South, especially where we are so athletically driven, it still is largely the case that the popular kids are the ones who are the good athletes. And in order to be liked, in order to be accepted, you've got to be a good athlete. And while that's better now, I think because of the extracurricular opportunities as compared to a few years ago, it's still pretty much what drives a lot of things. But then when you get to college, what happens? Well, those who were good athletes and weren't so sharp otherwise, or those who were popular in high school, kind of move over to the side, and those who were maybe the geeks, those who were the intellects, now they start finding leadership roles and leadership opportunities. But watch this. Even with that being the case, by the time they're 18 years old, so much of their self-esteem is already established. How they feel about themselves and their abilities, and all this matters. Now, there's a tricky part in here, and that sweet spot is very small that I talked about, and that is this. What do you do with the everybody gets a trophy? Ooh, no, not when I grew up. What do you do with all of this? And again, how do you find that sweet spot? Well, the point I want to make, and I'll continue to reiterate as we go with slides, is this. Those early years, when we can help them to understand they are loved, they are valued, they matter, is hugely important. Well, let's develop it. I'll quit preaching and get back to talking. So, teaching humility, is it possible or is it not? Because we will have one child who, every time they do something good, will want to make sure mom and dad knows, and they'll look for ways to make sure that they tell or somebody else. And we'll have another child who will do something good who doesn't need the pat on the back. So the first child who needs the pat on the back, are we able to change that? Ooh, that's the nature-nurture thing going on here. But look at this concept of teaching humility and realize that humility is important because it is those who are most lacking in confidence who seek most to promote themselves. In other words, often those who attempt to appear more confident are actually less confident. We realize that. The ones who tend to be the loudest, the ones who want to make sure people know things about them, the ones who act as though sometimes they have the greatest self-esteem, have the least self-esteem. And, on the other hand, truly humble children are generally okay with who they are or whom they are. They don't need the pats on the back. Why? Well, if you disagree with what I do, that's okay. Go do it anyway. I don't need to do something to impress you. Humble children don't feel a strong need to promote self. They don't feel a strong need to pretend to be something they are not. I know what happened. I've got an old version that I had played with. Humble children are not nearly as affected by peer pressure. This is going to throw me. Just work with me. But look at all this. Now, here's the question. Which child would you rather raise? The humble child or the child that's not humble? Oh, the humble children, we really don't have to have rules for them. Why? They just make good choices. They tend to do the right things. Well, I'm kind of beating a dead horse because we all agree we want humble children. They're easier. But how do we do it? Well, getting back to this idea of helping them to feel good about themselves and who and what they are is so big. And we have to start early. So, how do we do it? How to develop humble and confident children. Number one, the time to teach them that they are important in the sight of God is early on. If we are not blasting them with the story that you are so special to God, God cares so much for you, He loves you so very much, He is with you at all times making sure you're fine and you're okay. And when you're afraid, He's there. When you hurt, He's there. You know, the whole concept of God giving His Son for little children, I think we all kind of wonder how they deal with that. How do they process that? That's a pretty big thought for a pretty small cognitive way of thinking. But even that can be framed in age-appropriate ways. If I feel like I matter in a big way to God, I don't really have to worry so much about what you think about me. Now you think about that concept to a 1-year-old or a 2-year-old or a 3-year-old, even better. But secondly, how to develop humble and confident children? Discipline with love and care, not out of anger. Show disappointment and forgiveness, not resentment. Several years ago, we were living in Mobile, and on Wednesday night there was a mom who came in 3 or 4 minutes after Bible study had begun. The devotional at the beginning is here. And I will never forget, I think, that mother who walked down the middle aisle and sat right there on the second row with a 2-year-old, a 3-year-old, and she in one hand held the child's hand, and in the other hand she held a switch that she had cut off or broken off of a tree. Now, I know that situation, and there was some social immaturity there. And I think probably what she was doing was trying to show all of her church family that she was a good disciplinarian. But I wonder to this day what that child turned out like. That's been better than 30 years ago. Now, I grew up in a house that believed in discipline. Boy, howdy. And in our house, we believed in discipline and sometimes got it right and sometimes didn't get it right. And discipline is so very important, but when it hurts self-esteem, it's not good discipline. I had a good friend who passed away a few months ago who was a lawyer, and I was talking to him one day. In fact, he was 50 years old, almost 49. And I was talking to him a few weeks before he died, and not knowing that that was about to happen. And he was telling me a story about dealing with his daughter, and she had done something that for her age was pretty rebellious-like, even though she's a good girl, I believe. And he made a statement, and I was so proud of him. He said, I asked him, I said, what'd you do? He said, I didn't do anything. And I said, what do you mean you didn't do anything? He said, I didn't do anything right then because I promised myself years ago I would never discipline my children when I was angry. And I thought, wow, how important that is, how huge that is. It's important for us to not berate our children when we discipline them. It's perfectly good and fine to let them know that we're disappointed. But when we do that in such a way that they don't feel loved and forgiven, then problems come. Number 3, this one is the sweet spot, difficult part. Provide a diet of sincere praise and valuing. We're back to that everybody gets a trophy thing. Notice, and I should have bolded the word sincere. It's difficult sometimes to find things that we can praise our children with. And we don't want to do it so often that it becomes watered down and they go, oh mom, oh dad. But finding the right times to tell them how important they are and to brag on them when they do things. And by the way, remember the old Pavlov-Skinner mentality. Positive reinforcement increases desired behavior. It increases desired behavior. And so when our children do things that are good and we sincerely praise them and brag on them, then we're far more likely to get that desirable behavior repeated than if we ignore it. And we can find good things to brag on our children about which help them to feel like they matter. Number 4, provide a safe, loved, appreciated, and valued environment and home. I love those families. I love those homes where everybody hangs out at their house. Why? Because the child loves home, loves having people in his or her home. It's just the place that's comfortable. And that also helps greatly the ability for parents to be able to sit down and have talks with children and even their sons or daughters' friends, because they're cool, they're neat. Everybody loves going over there. Number 5, help children find what they are good at and support and promote them in these activities. Now, our kids never did travel ball. I'm not saying that's good or bad. I'm certainly not sitting here saying be one of these crazy parents that turns the world upside down for their children. I'm not making that point at all. But oh, how important it is in those early years to find their talents and abilities and help develop them. Why? Because it boosts their self-esteem. They feel like they matter. Others even look up to them. Now, sweet spot, it's small. And pushing them too far to the point that they get to that cocky stage, oh, that's one of those where we need to pray for wisdom every day. But when they grow up feeling inferior, feeling like everybody is better than them, then oftentimes they're going to start acting out, trying to get others to think more of them because they don't think they're as good as they ought to be. Start early. All right, number 5. What about social media? How large a part does social media play? And let's see what these slides look like. So look at some stories. They I think are all here. Look at some of the research, not stories. Look at some of the research. January of this year, 2022, by Digital Information World. How many hours do you think our young people spend a day on social media? On average. Teenagers and young adults, ages 16 to 24, spend the most time on social media, on average, 3 hours and 1 minute a day. This is not all media. I'll give you that number in a minute, hopefully. But social media. Now you tell me how much power we are giving to any resource that has our children's attention 3 hours and 1 minute a day. That's pretty powerful, isn't it? It's unbelievably powerful. Well, but let's keep going. Adults between the ages of 25 and 34, 2 hours and 37 minutes a day. They've got a pretty good example of no big deal to use it a lot. 35 to 44-year-olds, 2 hours and 4 minutes of social media time per day. 45 to 54-year-olds, I'll get to my class in a minute, 1 hour and 39 minutes a day. And finally, 55 to 64-year-olds, an hour and 13 minutes a day. Now, again, my point is, let's just all go ahead and recognize and admit that social media has a great ability to influence us all. Now, several of you know that when I was at Freed-Hardeman for a lot of years, all of information technology was in my area. I loved IT. I'm far enough away from it that I don't know it and don't love it the way I used to. I'm not against technology, and in fact, I love and embrace technology, but social media scares me to death. Why? Because the numbers that I've just given. Well, look at this one. A year ago, 2021, Common Sense Media reported that kids and teens spend a lot of time, we knew that, how much children spend from 5 to 7.5 hours a day influenced by not just social media, but all media. What's interesting about this research is there are several different forms of research that were done during this period, and they all provided very common results. By all media, they're talking about music, they're talking about video games, they're talking about TV, all forms of media, newspapers, books would fall into that. But again, look at the number. And when I show this and when I consider it, even I myself want to go, how is that possible? But again, what's the point? The point is we have to be careful. We have to be careful about what we expose our children to. And I'll jump off here for a minute and say this. Smartphones, I left mine in the truck. I'd have a hard time living without it today. I rely on it very heavily. And I remember when we got Carter his first smartphone, John Bentley, not Bennett, John Bentley, who was IT director at Freed-Hardeman, found out that we had given Carter a cell phone, and he said, "Oh, you got an automatic tracking device, huh?" And I said, "Yeah." And we need those, we think. And I understand that. However, back in the day, it was when they turned 16. How many of us can wait until our kids turn 16 before we give in to that pressure today? But watch this. Do you think about what they're being exposed to? And the thing I say that catches especially mom's attention is this. When you give your 12-year-old a smartphone, would you take a box of Hustler magazine publications and take it into your 12-year-old son's bedroom and put it at the foot of the bed and say, "Don't read it," and walk away? When we look at it that way, we'd go, there's no way we would do that. That would be completely irresponsible. But what I want to tell you is, when we give our 12-year-old, 8-year-old, 9-year-old, 16-year-old kids smartphones and don't help them manage them, we are doing the same thing. Why? Because they don't have the maturity, spiritual or otherwise, to handle those temptations. But too often we think, "Oh, my son wouldn't do that, my daughter wouldn't do that, I don't want to think about that." Well, leave the box at the foot of the bed and hope they're not looking at it, because that's exactly what we're doing. Makes sense, doesn't it? What is my point again with this? My point is, media affects us and our children, and we need to be careful to help them. Even going back to 2016, this CNN study, 61% of teens say they want to see if their online posts are getting likes and comments. Now, I got to speed up and get through this pretty quick, but I want you to tie together this research with what we said earlier about self-esteem. Why? I'll describe it real quickly. All of us can think back on our growing up days at school, and we can tell where we thought we stood in the popularity or on the popularity spectrum. And I don't care how old we are, and I don't care if we went to a one-room schoolhouse that only had 10 kids in it for 3 grades. I expect each and every one of us in here remembers what it feels like to want to be popular when we were growing up. I remember that. I think we all do. Now, it's a new day. It's not a new desire. The new desire is to use social media to try to boost that popularity or determine where they are. Look and see if this doesn't prove it. 61% of teens said they wanted to see if their online posts are getting likes and comments. 36% of teens said they wanted to see if their friends are doing things without them. 21% of teens said they wanted to make sure no one was saying mean things about them. But just look at those 3, and you see the new day way of kids still having such a big deal of how others feel about them and how popular they are. Now, part of what I'll say quickly before we go on is this last, or the first point that I mentioned, and that is this. Oh, how important it is for them to feel good about themselves so that this doesn't matter. And number 2, how important it is for parents to be involved in things like social and other types of media. Because the pressures are so great and we are so busy, it's easy for us to allow those kids to be pressured and developed in ways that they don't need to be pressured and developed because we're not involved in understanding. Make sense? All right, let's go back. Number 3. Sean, get me back to grandparents real quick. So, what about grandparents? Well, we have 3 grandchildren, and it's easier for me to understand the concept of grandchildren. Second slide, I think. It's easier for me to talk about the dynamics between especially grandparents and their grown adult children when grandchildren come along. Changes things, doesn't it? Oh, the relationships change, priorities change. How many times has Haley said to me, "Dad, who are you and what did you do with my dad?" Why? Well, because learn some things, treat grandchildren differently from children. And yes, I realize I'm meddling now. The grandparents were just able to sit here up until now and agree and shake their head and say, "Boy, this is so good." But let's see how they feel after this one. All right, so give me a second. There's a reason I bring hard copies. I want to make sure I don't leave anything out. All right, so remember the story of Timothy. Remember that Timothy was very much raised by mom and grandma, by Lois and Eunice, and how, especially when we are in situations where we are close to our children, as grandparents, we have a lot of involvement with our grandchildren. So I want you to think about these changes that take place when grandchildren come along, and especially between grandparents and their grown children or parents. First of all, my in-laws now have a new role. They are now my baby's grandparents. Oh, well, that becomes very real and changes several things, and I'll talk briefly about that. Number two, my parents have a hard time letting me be independent. And I hear often things like, "Well, if I were you, I would do," or "you ought to." And what usually goes along with that is, "And you know what, Mom and Dad didn't have it all figured out either, and why are they trying to tell me what to do?" And remember how most of us felt who have older children, and that is when they were first born, we thought we knew exactly how to raise those rascals. And especially if the first one did so well, and all that I've talked about before. And then when Mom and Dad say things like, "Oh, I don't think I'd let him eat that now," or "Why is she not in bed?" or "Shouldn't you be?" And we're sitting there remembering the list of mistakes that they made, that even if we have dementia and Alzheimer's to the point that we can't remember our name, we'll remember those things. Yeah, we remember those well. And so when Mom and Dad have a hard time letting the one who was so dependent on us for 20 whatever years now be independent, that's a very difficult thing to do. And number three, my parents didn't do everything right. Now they want to tell me how to parent. Number four, I need my parents or in-laws to help, but I need them to help when I want them to. Yeah, that's easy for us to kind of pick and choose. And what about this one? If parents or grandparents are helping financially, for some reason they think they can have say-so. I understand that reason. That's why it's so very important for us to raise our children to be independent, and then for us to let them be independent. I'm not saying it's a bad thing for us to help our kids, but when they are relying on us financially, it just messes so many things up. So this whole dynamic is very difficult in ways. So I've got some suggestions for parents and grandparents when kids come along. First of all, for parents, it's okay, young mothers and dads, for you to tell Mom and Dad, "Today's not a good day." It's okay for you to say, "I know you want to come over, but we've got things going on and today's not a good day." That's a very difficult thing to do for a grown child who has a child, and here's how I'll equate that. In the same way that it was so very difficult for me to quit telling my children what they should do that magical day when they went from being responsible to me to being independent. Man, that's the hardest switch in the world to flip, I think. It's also hard in the other way around for children to go from not telling mom and dad what to do to voicing their opinions or to voice what they need. And so many times, even in the counseling room, I'll have a grown child who will say, "Ooh, I can't tell mom that it's not a good day not to come over." Well, you need to. Why? Because if you don't, she'll come, resentment will build up, and eventually an explosion will take place. For parents, number 2, don't expect your spouse to deal with your parents. Now, that one's difficult, and it's easy to want to do because of what I said just a moment ago. I don't want to have to tell my mom, "No, you tell." Or I'm on the phone with mom, "Well, Joe said it would be better if you..." What happens when we do that? We start driving wedges between parents and sons and daughters-in-law. And when that happens, it grows and grows and grows. And in the same way, if it's my kids at school that are causing the problem, I need to deal with it. If there are situations with mom and dad, then I need to deal with it and not expect my spouse to do that. For parents, number 3, be considerate. The young generation now of families are the busiest there has ever been, I'm convinced. So busy. And as with our kids, we have a hard time slowing Carter and Haley and their families down enough to have some time for us. And it's a little selfish for me to stand here and say, yeah, grandparents want some time with their grandkids. So make sure you're considerate. And they try and do a good job of that on the most part. Last section, I know time's about gone. Suggestions for grandparents. Now, I should have saved this for the last night and then run out. That was supposed to be funny. But for grandparents, allow your children to be adults and independent. And a part of this, allow them to make mistakes. Why? Because much of what we learn, the best of those oftentimes comes from making mistakes. And, I don't know a set of grandparents anywhere that haven't looked at the way their children were raising their grandparents and thought, I wish they would have done, or I wish they would have done this. But in the same way that we didn't want our moms and dads telling us what to do, we need to be careful and realize we raise them to be independent and let them be independent. Will they make some mistakes? Of course they will. And especially if they do everything we tell them to, they'll make mistakes there too. Plus get to the point where they're relying on us instead of their own judgment, which is not good. Number 3, this one's important. Give advice when it's asked for. Not every time you think it needs to be given. That's a part of this let them be adults thing. And I'm telling you, it's difficult. It's difficult. Because for 20 whatever years, we were responsible for keeping them alive. We were responsible for giving them permission. We were responsible for them in every way. And then it's almost like suddenly we don't have that responsibility anymore. But the hardest thing in the world for us as parents of grown children to do is to turn off the tell them what to do button. Now, if they want our advice, they should ask for it. And we have to be careful. Tina sometimes reminds me when I'm on the phone, she'll shake her head when I say to Carter, well, if I were you, I would. And she'll go, and I'll go, oh, that's right, I'm not him. I need to be careful of that type of thing. And finally, the last one, never make your grandchild's parent out to be the bad guy. For example, well, if you were at my house, I'd let you eat that. Have you ever said anything like that? Or, if I don't know why your mom won't let you come over today. What are we doing? We're creating issues We're creating hardship. We're creating hurt feelings. We can be our children's best cheerleaders and best supporters if we will be